as soon as possible. Apologies again. My guest and conversation partner this evening is John Gollings, AM. He holds a master's degree in architecture from RMIT University and an honorary fellowship in the Australian Institute of Architects. He is an adjunct professor at the School of Media and Communications at RMIT University. He works in the Asia-Pacific region as an architectural photographer, much of the work involving long-term cultural projects, especially in India, Cambodia, China, Indonesia, Libya, and New Guinea. He specialises in the documentation of cities, old and new, often from the air. He has a particular interest in the cyclic fires and floods that characterise the Australian landscape, and he documents these with aerial photography. He was co-creative director of the Venice Architectural Biennale in 2010. His books and publications include 2 volumes of New Australia Style, published by Thames and Hudson, City of Victory, Aperture, and Kashgar, Oasis City on China's Old Silk Road, Francis Lincoln Limited. In 2012, Thames and Hudson published Beautiful Ugly, a monograph of his contemporary architectural photography. His work is held in national and international collections, including Asia Society, New York, Canadian Centre for Architecture, Montreal, Australian National Gallery in Canberra, National Gallery of Victoria in Melbourne, National Portrait Gallery, Canberra, Monash Gallery of Art, Melbourne, State Library of Queensland in Brisbane, Janet Holmes A. Court Collection, Kowarannup, Gold Coast City Gallery, Surfers Paradise, Rockhampton Art Gallery in Rockhampton, and the National Library of Australia in Canberra. The Kaladahan Museum in Karnataka, India, was built by Jindal Steel Company to house John's 40 years of work documenting the Hampi ruins. His work has been recently included in exhibitions at the Australian Centre of Photography, Sydney, Gold Coast City Gallery, Surfers Paradise, Immigration Museum, Melbourne, Fremantle Arts Centre, Perth, and the National Gallery of Australia, Canberra. In 2013, McClellan Gallery exhibited Aftermath, Gollings' bushfires series from Black Saturday. Gollings' retrospective, A History of the Built World, opened at the Monash Gallery of Art in 2018 and is now showing through India. His documentation of Nawala Rock Art Site, A Spirit of Place, was at Heide Gallery of Modern Art in 2019. He has twice received the Australian Institute of Architects President's Prize, and in 2013 he was awarded the inaugural William J. Mitchell International Committee Prize by the Australian Institute of Architects. In 2016, he was made the Member of the Order of Australia for significant service to photography through the documentation of iconic architectural landmarks in Australia and the Asia-Pacific region. John, welcome to the program.
Thank you. I was daunted hearing all of that. I don't know how I fitted it in.
Well, there's not a dull bit in that bio because you have such a long career that continues and continues truly from strength to strength. And I'm very curious a bit later in the conversation. I am so interested to talk about some of that change over time and new technology. But first, I want to go back to the very beginning. Yep. And there's a question I love to ask all my guests. It's what's your earliest memory of a building or place?
Of a building? Certainly a place, and it was Mount Donabuang, and I'm reliably told by my mother that I was 3 years old and that you're not meant to remember back to 3 years old, possibly because it was so freezing cold, but I remember throwing snowballs, and that's my earliest memory of a place.
Mountains, beauty, landscape, and you continue photographing from high places.
Yeah. Of a house, I guess it's the family houses that we lived in, because I was very conscious of moving from room to room, and I had a grandmother lived in a back room and she was a little bit senile, and I was sort of curious to go and visit her all the time and jump on a bed and annoy her. And then my father built 2 family houses and we were all very involved in setting them up, I guess. So the family house was the central understanding of a building.
And your first introduction to a construction site too?
Yep. Yes, because my father was he was a nurseryman at first, but he became a builder, and I was meant to be the architect in the family building firm. But that came to grief.
That didn't work out.
Well, he didn't like modern architecture, it turned out. He had a very successful business building very conventional blocks of flats.
Right.
Yeah, so
And what era was that?
that would be in the 60s, I guess. Yeah.
So those flats we're used to seeing around the inner city.
Yep. Yeah, all around south of the Yarra.
Which now people are falling over themselves to get because they're well built and sturdy.
I know, and they had high ceilings and they were conventional in their planning, but it turns out that people prefer to have rooms rather than everything in one space in many cases.
Had you met architects before when you were still seeing that as a career path for yourself?
No. I just loved the creative aspect. I loved the idea of designing, and it really went from there. But I'd already become a photographer, and that was probably the first passion.
Oh, really? What was your first introduction to the camera?
I found my father's folding Kodak camera in a shed in his nursery, and we lived at the front of the nursery. And I was just intrigued with it, and I think I was about 8 or 9 years old, and I opened it up, and one of my father's workers was a photographer, and he loaded a roll of 120 film, and I went out and took snaps of my brother and sister jumping off heaps of dirt in the backyard.
Wow.
And that night, that friend Ray went and processed the film and brought back little contact prints, and I know I was hooked from that moment on. And a couple of days later, he took me back to his home darkroom and taught me developing and printing, and I just became obsessed with the technology, the chemistry, the optics, and started to read everything I could, and totally self-taught.
How old were you?
By the time I got my first camera, I was 11 years old. And there's a photograph I often show in lectures of me in this bright orange sweater, carrying every bit of equipment I owned, sort of tripods and 2 camera cases and more cameras slung around my neck. It's my proudest memory, I think.
I love that.
Yeah.
If you can share that image with us, we'll share it on Instagram for the listeners
I can send it to, yeah.
as a follow up for the follow up post. Do you remember how old you would have been, and also what was that image? That the first image that you thought that this is a good photograph. This is a serious photograph.
I remember it. My mother was a florist, and she had done this big bowl of flowers in a very designy, florid bowl, and I had just got a flash gun, and I took this flash picture of it, and it was incredibly sharp and clear, and I showed it to my father, who soundly criticised it because I'd cropped into the flowers. It was my first lesson in I was so taken away by the sharpness of the picture and the technology that I'd forgotten that it's also meant to hang together as a photograph. And he criticised it, and I was totally shattered there for a while. Subsequently, of course, it was Harry Seidler who had the same reaction to another photograph I'd taken and gave me the biggest lesson of my life, which was never, ever crop into a building. You must show the whole building, otherwise it could go on for another 100 yards, as Harry said to me. And that's my first really show the whole building.
Wow.
I've never forgotten that lesson, but it started with my father saying, you've cropped into the bowl of flowers. But it was technically a great shot. I'd never done a sharper photo in my life.
Wow. What were you photographing for Harry Seidler?
The Waverley Civic Centre, which is now where the Monash Gallery of Art is. It was one of Harry's first Melbourne jobs. And he'd played with me for years, ringing me up and saying, what cameras do you use? And I ended up having to match everything that Max Dupain had before he'd even trust me. And even then, it was only because Max couldn't get to Melbourne that Harry reluctantly used me. But it turned out to be a great job, except for that one instance where he rejected. It was all on Polaroid in those days. I pulled the Polaroid and handed it to him, and he said, that's a completely useless photograph. I thought it was a brilliant photograph of the entrance porch. He said, you've cropped into my building. You must never do that.
Wow.
So that was a big lesson.
And now details and tight cropping and really tricky angles are all the rage. I love that it also came full circle for you in a way to then show your own work and your own photography in that same gallery.
Exactly, yes. I'm very conscious of that. And they've been a great supporter of all of my work. So, yeah, it's certainly come full circle for me in that respect.
So you were an emerging photographer and you went to study at RMIT to gain qualifications as an architect or begin the process of architecture
First
training.
of all, Melbourne Uni. I did architecture under Brian Lewis. and Neville Quarry and Hugh O'Neill were my first year masters. So they taught me, and I dropped out at the end of that bachelor's degree and then went back to RMIT and did a master's. So mainly I think to please my parents who were really annoyed. They didn't think photography was a good career. They were, they'd come through the Depression with nothing. They'd worked hard and put us through private school, and they thought we and my brother and sister should have a profession. So they were a bit disappointed when I ultimately became a photographer, until they realised that I was actually getting some significant work up.
It would have been the foundation, though, for your appreciation of architecture in having that training.
Oh, absolutely, totally. And I still love designing bits of building. It's a fantastic profession, but it's also a hard profession to work at. I'm glad I work in it as a photographer, but I get the best bits. I think to be a practicing architect these days is hard on the ego and it's hard on the pocketbook.
Did you ever work in practice after you graduated?
Yes, I had a specialty. I had a team of builders I've met through my father. I did instant transformations of pop-up shops, and I specialised in getting a shop up and running, and I designed all the interiors in about 5 days. And that was good fun. I did that quite a lot.
That seems like the rapid fire product of an RMIT education.
Exactly, yeah.
Get the design up fast. That feels very, very familiar.
In between working at nightclubs, taking nightclub photographs, which was a sort of another way of earning income, because I had 2 kids at that stage. I just needed to keep working very hard.
Did you feel the same passion taking other images of other subjects when you were photographing people or flowers?
Yes, it was incredibly important to me. I was segued out of architecture school by a friend, Kevin Orpin, whose photography partner had just walked out on him, and he needed another photographer in the studio. And I'd met him through Rennie Ellis, and I knew a few photographers and art directors. And he rang up and said, "Look, I've employed another photographer, and I promised him an assistant. Would you come in and start next Monday and assist?" And so at that point I dropped out of architecture school and went into this photographic studio, and I was assisting a young photographer who'd come out from England, but he got bored with it. This is mid-60s, late 60s. They didn't really need assistants like we do now. So the studio said, "We'll knock up a folio and send you out to work." And I've sort of been incredibly lucky all my life, but Rennie Ellis shot a poster of me and they sent it around to all the ad agencies, and they sent me out. And I met this chap, Barton Goal, who'd been, ironically, a few years ahead of me at school. And he was the art director on the Marlborough account. And he was quite intrigued with my portfolio. It was a big A2 book, spiral bound, with quirky photographs, because I wasn't really a photographer. I just loved it. And so we had a nice chat, and I went out, and a week later he rang up and said, "Look, I've been out on a Marlborough shoot for 5 days with this photographer, Kurt Veld." And Kurt was a charismatic person who didn't know anything technically, and he'd overexposed all the transparency film, and the studio I was in had a processing lab. And I remember this big discussion with all these people fretting it that he hasn't got the exposure right. And I put my hand up and said, "I can save the job." And I said, "Process it as colour negative. And so the overexposure will produce more dye density on the film and you'll get the pictures back." And they did that. And I saved the job, 178 rolls of film, big, massive job. And then another week later he rang up and said, "You won't believe it, but you saved the job technically, but there's not a single usable photograph there that we like. We've got $250 left in the budget. Do you want to do a Marlborough shoot in 1 day?" And out of that 1 day, I had 1 camera, 1 lens. I got 3 24-sheet billboards that were up and down Kingsway. And that started me as an advertising photographer with the biggest account in Australia.
Wow.
And I was 21 or 22. So that's how I got
Do
started.
you really believe it was luck?
It was a combination. I was nervous taking those photographs but that led on to some other. I mean, I was then made the photographer at Sitmar Line, so they took me on the Fair Star to all the islands of the South Pacific. And I did Australia Post and I did Camelco. I unbelievably fell into these enormous jobs, and I suppose I kept getting them because I kept producing different imagery. And then finally the sort of the highlight was the Get Wrecked on Great Keppel campaign, which was these series of quite naughty photographs promising, Great Keppel was an island for singles, promising sex and fun. And that won a lot of awards, and that's work that's now held in the Rockhampton Gallery. So I'm proud of that stuff.
And part of Australian history too.
But I think shortly after that, my colleagues from architecture school, like Denton Corker Marshall and Greg Burgess and Peter Elliott, I mean a whole string of them, were starting to get buildings built, and I was the sort of go-to photographer. So I started getting architectural work. But I brought into that architectural photography the idea that I'd got as an advertising photographer, that it was up to me to invent the photograph, to invent an attention-getting photograph. So rather than just shoot the building as it was, I would work at night. Sunsets,
flying
flash,
footballs,
trees through the middle of the picture, my daughter flying through sky.
Kangaroos, footballs.
Which I'm vaguely embarrassed now, but they've become iconic images and they're collected. So that difference, what made my work different, especially against Max Dupain and Wolfgang Sievers and Mark Strizig, was that input that came from advertising photography. So that's the point of difference.
The actual image making and that extra art direction.
Yep. Whereas everyone else is just trying to learn how to photograph a building, get the exposure right. Whereas I'm proud of that work now. And in a funny way, I flirt with it today, but it's done differently, slightly differently, more subtly, I think.
You mentioned earlier that you weren't really a photographer then, like when you were doing particularly the Marlborough shoot. At what point do you remember flicking that switch and saying, okay, I'm a photographer now?
Good question. I was still incredibly nervous. Probably I was starting to feel confident up on Great Keppel. I had a team of models and I had hair and makeup, and people they started to defer to me as the sort of leader of the team. And at that point, I think technically I started to feel really accomplished. And I had enough money to buy more Hasselblad lenses and more Nikon lenses, and then I employed an assistant. And I think at that time you're pretty serious about it.
Then you've made it.
Pretty much, yeah.
Going back to photographing architecture, did it feel like an element of closure after having the education?
It got me back into the profession, which I loved, and it developed great relationship with people who to this day are my closest friends. I don't know that many photographers. The world I mix in is architecture still. I've had a couple of assistants like Diana Snape who've gone on to become brilliant photographers in their own right. And I'm proud of that. I'm proud of having taught a few good photographers. But no, I exist in the world of architecture and a design world, I guess.
The next generation of both photographers and creatives and perhaps even young architects listening.
Well, the profession's changing. I went through analogue to digital, a shift. Now we're going into social media. Magazines are collapsing. There's not the printed medium. A lot of my work is now done on an iPhone, a good iPhone, by the way. But it's completely changing, and I don't think people are that interested in a still photograph anymore. They want movement. Sometimes, especially architects, most of whom are now doing a lot of their own social media and Instagram, and they're getting a little bit of video off their phone and posting it. It's crazily inconsequential in a funny way. I can get more information in a still photograph than someone waving their video camera around, but they want that sense of movement. So I'm telling young photographers, you've got to get into video and you've got to get into movement. And somehow you've got to work out how to also compose it properly, which is not something I've readily come to. But so it's a massive change, and I don't quite know where it's heading. Well, I do know people are flirting with artificial intelligence, and there's some ludicrous stuff coming out.
I will circle back to AI a bit later in this conversation. I'm really interested in this change over time and technology that you've experienced. But I want to jump back to some of the work you've been doing in India. 40 years of work and continued work, and you're showing there. How did this interest emerge?
I was taught by Neville Quarry, who went on to be head of Sydney Architecture School, but Neville was moved to New Guinea, and he took my classmates who had graduated with him, like Tony Stone-Brown, up to New Guinea to teach architecture. And being good mates, they said, I'll come up and have a look around. And I went up and they introduced me to students, all of whom had come from villages in the Highlands. And one of them said, I think the Mount Hagen Games were on. And they said, do you want to come up to Mount Hagen? Anyway, I went up there. I had a 1,000mm mirror lens, a rare Russian Katody optic lens. And I shot the Mount Hagen show, but I did an extreme telephoto which compressed all the people. And then I got so excited I went back for the next 3 years up and down to New Guinea, photographing all the dance and decoration styles of every village in New Guinea. And then I got one of the very first Visual Arts Board grants to actually exhibit those photographs. And that was my first cultural project that I'd done for myself with my own money. And I guess in a sense it was the first of my love of dead cities, because that dying decoration in New Guinea was an extraordinary documentation, and that works all in the National Gallery in Canberra now. So that was my first overseas experience. The next one was George Michel, who'd done architecture with me, had gone off to do his PhD in Indian architecture, and he'd come back one year and he gave a little slideshow in Melbourne, in Kew, where we all lived. And he said, I've just been to this place called Hampi, and we were both taught about it by Hugh O'Neill in first year, because Hugh was the first Australian to ever go there back in the 50s. And he said, look, it's really interesting. It's one of the only purpose-built imperial cities in the world. And they lasted for 1,000 years, and then they got arrogant and they lost a battle with the Muslim armies that were pushing down from Delhi. And that defeat is the same smug behaviour that's going to be their downfall. Anyway, the Muslims spent 6 months destroying temples, and the temples today are world monuments. And so I started photographing. I went there. George said, "Oh, come back with me. If you want to see India, it's too big a country to tackle. Come to one place, stay there for a fortnight, get to know it, and that you'll get the Indian experience." And I did, and that was 1980. And I fell in love with it. And the next year I went back with Peter Lovell and a whole lot of other people. And I took students across who would then do measured drawings of all the buildings, and I'd photograph the temples. And I've just been going back every year ever since. And I'm going back again in January.
Wow.
Last time I went across to show my sister what I'd been doing all my life, and I took a drone, and that, I mean, it's totally illegal, but I couldn't resist. I really wanted, after all these years, to get aerial shots of how, and I sort of managed it. I got chased around a little bit.
Did you get away with it?
I got away with it, yeah, and I've got amazing shots now.
Better to beg for forgiveness than ask for permission.
Yeah, always, yeah.
In 40 years of photographing this site, of course, your technology has also evolved that you're working with.
Massively, yes. I started on 35mm Kodachrome, and then I went to 4x5 large format architectural cameras, and I had blow up changing bags that I'd blow up to load the 4.5 film in the middle of the night. So I'd get 40 or 50 shots the next day, and then I had to download that all in a portable darkroom. I did phenomenal stuff on that. Anyway, then came digital. So then I went back with all the various digital cameras and progressively updated and upgraded them, and then reshot everything again in digital. But the books I've got a couple of books coming out next month. They're still drawing on some of those very early days, because the Indians have in some ways mucked up the site. Instead of restoring some of the buildings, they've put fences around them. They shut them at 5 o'clock at night, and they've locked some of the buildings up, so you can't get the photographs that I've got originally. So I've got really rare images of,
Wow.
of sites, with no fences around them and things. So they keep entertaining me by changing things.
Didn't predict about the site.
Only in the sense of the geometry of the urban planning brilliantly matched the geometry of the site of the landscape, I guess. So very long vistas leading to a temple, some windy roads that go up mountains. Incredibly well integrated roads and bridges and infrastructure. That was all done by humans and maybe elephants. A real lesson in ingenuity, but the extraordinary quality of the sculptural programs, it just leaves you breathless.
Wow.
It's one of the great sites of the world. And it's kept me busy for all those 40 years.
For very good reason.
Yeah.
You're the only person to photograph another extremely unique site at Nawala, 46,000 years old, in Australia, in the outback.
I've always loved shooting rock art, and I've done a lot of it. But I read about this discovery. It's probably 6 years ago now. It was discovered by an archaeologist who was flying over it, and he looked down, thought, that looks interesting, and landed his helicopter and made this extraordinary discovery of this site, which is hadn't been visited for 500 years. It had been continuously painted over, but it was a washed-out gorge, and there were little pilates columns, but they pulled out 70 of them, the Monash researchers discovered, to create a painting ceiling, which they then painted. They think it was a site, a gathering place, not the permanent place of any one clan. Anyway, no one had discovered it until this archaeologist. And I heard about it, and I had some friends who knew some other archaeologists who knew who he was, and I got introduced. And he said the sole custodian is this woman called Auntie Margaret. And I got in touch with Auntie Margaret, and she said, yes, I'd love to go back with you. So I went back with my 16-year-old son at that stage, and a friend who'd made all these contacts. And we flew there in a helicopter and stayed there for 4 or 5 days, slept on the ground. Auntie Margaret lit fires to chase any people even know where it is. I've got the GPS coordinates. Anyway, it's the most extraordinary set of photographs that I've ever taken. It just imbued me with this thing. Love for the whole Indigenous world and the quality of their artwork and the quality of their response to country. Yes. And I've developed that same sensitivity to country. And I'm photographing them in a different... I'm not just copying them like a painting. I'm lighting them and creating an ambience that extracts more information out of the rock art photography. So I guess the Australian outback is one of my dead cities.
You're continuing also to the same practice of curating the image.
Yes.
Just as you were with the football and the kangaroo and the airborne daughter.
You sort of can't quite help it. First of all, you work out the composition, then you work out a way to make the viewer get to understand it as quickly as possible, which is what I do with architecture too.
You have to tell the story.
Yeah. But that also means that maybe the air conditioning duct, which is distracting to the eye, has to go. And then quite a few other things have to go, and a few lampposts have to go. I've got no compunction altering a photograph in order for the viewer to read the building itself more clearly. So in a sense, my architectural photography really doesn't have that much to do with the actual building. It's more to do with the architect's desire and ambition.
And to capture the design intent. But it becomes
Exactly.
it becomes a moment in history, though, because, say, back to K Street housing for Edmund and Corrigan, those images are iconic, and they become a work of art of their own, and they capture this moment in time.
It's funny, isn't it? And that was only because Peter Corrigan was asked to submit pictures to Domus magazine, and they'd come back and said, the architecture's terrific, but the photographs are rubbish. Get a real photographer. Now, it just happened that I'd gone to school with Maggie Edmonds. She was older, and we'd gone to dancing class together, and she introduced me to Peter years ago. And so Peter rang me up and said, you go and do these churches, they've got to go in Domus magazine and the K Street housing. And it just occurred to me, wouldn't it be funny, because they're being published in Italy, rather than them seeing that we have dogs in the street, I thought, let them understand that Australia has kangaroos in the street. And at that moment, I was the head photographer for Melbourne Zoo. And so I got permission to sort of quite naughtily run around the zoo at night with a flash gun chasing kangaroos. And that's how I flashed the kangaroos that are in the Corrigan shot.
You would not get away with that now, would you?
No, absolutely wouldn't. Yeah.
Did you photograph the Keysborough Church of the Resurrection?
Yep.
It's just down the road, really, around the corner from where we're broadcasting here at the Roy Dog Pavilion, very close by.
Yeah. No, I had fun with all those Corrigan churches. Because Peter was quite religious, and he picked up all this Catholic church work. And again, under Peter's direction, he encouraged me to sort of be pretty wild. He liked snapshots. He liked wedding photos. I was trying to strike a balance between the snapshot and a meaningful architectural coverage.
That's a really beautiful idea. It's those photographs that are first documentation of a brand new, fresh building, if you will, are kind of the wedding photos of the building.
Exactly.
As it becomes married and available and open to public life. It's the first images of its debut.
Which led to another learning curve, because the Keysborough Church, I actually made this passing comment about it, it'll be so much better when the trees grow up, because it was just a bare bit of dirt. And Peter turned on me furiously and said, if architecture depended on landscape, there'd be nothing ever built. Just photograph the fucking thing, will you? And I've never forgotten that. So, first just photograph the building.
And don't crop it too tight.
And no, never.
So you don't do detail shots or those close-ups in your work?
I discovered the magazines didn't really want to publish them, and no one wanted them. It was sort of, when film was expensive, it was a waste of time.
Yes.
There's enough work for me to just get all the angles and all the rooms and the connections between the interiors, and that can take all the time in the world. The idea of cropping into a sort of pink-coloured wall with one door in it, it might be a pretty picture, but it doesn't describe architecture, and that's my beef with a lot of the youngies now.
Not every piece of design that makes a building. Not every building is architecture. It's quite an interesting concept. What does architecture mean to you, and what constitutes architecture and good architecture?
I think the designer has to have a sensitivity to the human condition. He has to understand what it's like to actually move through a room. He needs to understand materiality and the effect of texture. And then he's got to bring another quality of surprise, I guess, which could be in his various attitudes to architecture, his design ethos, or it's just out of the blue, someone who's just so profoundly good at putting volumes together, like Ando, an inexplicable understanding of how to pull it all together. And that's a pretty rare combination, I think. And don't ask me who my favourite architects are or my favourite building, because it's an impossible question. But you know it when you see it.
You know good design when you see it. That's really, really true.
Yeah.
Well, I'll ask you, what's your favourite destination to visit other than India, and where do you think all young architects should travel to?
My favourite is Cambodia. I've through various guises been asked to photograph every single Khmer temple in the world, which I've now done. It took 7 years,
really?
But through Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia. And the architecture is uniformly probably more creative and certainly at Angkor Wat than any other lost city. And I got there by serendipity. At that stage, in the late 80s, Gareth Evans was our foreign minister, and Gareth Evans had put together the Paris peace talks, which brought Hun Sen to power. And he was so impressed with this Australian politician that he offered the National Gallery in Canberra the first ever travelling exhibition of Khmer art. And the story was that he'd just come into Phnom Penh. Phnom Penh had been emptied by the Khmer Rouge. They had the original museum inhabitants, curators, had hidden all the treasures in the basement of the Phnom Penh Museum and locked it up. And the Khmer Rouge never knew about it and never got there. Hun Sen sent me and Michael Brand, who was the curator of the National Gallery in Canberra, to Phnom Penh to break open the museum basement, build a photographic studio, choose whatever objects we like, photograph them, produce a catalogue, and ironically, Nonda Katsalidis, who's bored with architect, that was my assistant. So Nonda went up there and helped me document this incredibly rare. So anyway, that exhibition did go to Canberra, but Hun Sen then said, why don't you go to Angkor Wat and photograph the actual architecture? So he sent me up there. It was completely empty. It was still mined. I was the only photographer in the whole of Angkor. I stayed for $20 a night in the hotel. And I spent a week photographing all the best bits of Angkor Wat on 4x5 sheet
Still
film.
mined. How did you stay safe? How?
Oh, you had to follow the cow tracks.
Oh,
That was the rule. That's all I did.
If the
Always
cow
put
was
a cow
okay.
ahead of me.
wow.
And I found a taxi driver who had been head of police, but he'd been locked up for 5 years. He'd got out and he had a Colt 44 under the seat of his taxi. He said, I'll take you around and I'll protect you. So he guided me. I was the only person there. To this day, I can't believe it.
Wow.
And Nonda Katsalidis flew back to Melbourne to bid on an auction for the Hyatt Hotel site and missed the adventure. Really dumb thing to do.
It's now full of crowds and tourists,
and they're
you'd kill to
basically
see it empty.
they're banned photography. It's awful there as an experience. I still go back every year because I've got good friends there, but it's not the same.
What amazing timing. And perhaps, as we started earlier in this conversation, luck
Yeah.
in some elements.
And partly one of my rules in life is to say yes to everything, which can be a dodgy way to go about stuff. But generally, it's led on to amazing experiences.
Wow.
And you don't quite know what you're getting into, but you end up somewhere and you just start working. And yeah, so say yes to everything.
That's very good advice.
Yeah.
7 years for every Khmer temple. How do you maintain your tenacity and energy and passion for these really long projects that are quite physical, right? You are heading out onto site, you're setting up gear, you've got equipment.
I've had great locals and great authors who have made contacts, and then we usually end up with a minibus or a taxi, and we just go from village to village, and we stay locally and eat the local food, and I'm happy to do that. There's nothing fancy about it, and we just go from temple to temple, and some are hidden in jungles. And, it's just a challenge, but you're surrounded by really nice people and you're just having a good time. My author on Cambodia, Helen Jessup, is 95 now and lives in New York, and she's still travelling with me. I'm having trouble getting the final text out of her, but we'll get there.
You publish your images often and frequently. I think you should do a memoir. So many stories.
There was an architect, Dennis Carter, was starting to write one, but he was getting bogged down. I decided I didn't want a biography. But last year I gave a couple of heritage addresses, and they said, just tell us about the stories behind the photographs. And that was so successful that I've now decided that the book will be me writing the stories behind 100 of my best photos.
Oh, we can't wait.
Yeah, and that'll be an interesting. It won't go into born in South Melbourne and did this and did that. It's just
The stories
the
behind the
stories
photo.
are pretty interesting. Yeah.
When can we look forward to that one?
The minute I get back
From the next adventure.
Well, my next job is to go to Uzbekistan to shoot a book on the arts and crafts of Uzbekistan, and that's in March. And after that, I might be able to get on to this one. I'm also I'm putting together an exhibition of portraits because no one knows I photograph people. And I've been doing that for years. So I started off with the Rolling Stones and Bob Dylan, the whole of local Melbournians. And, so...
How does no one know you photograph so many celebrities?
No one knows. But accidentally, I've photographed the Queen, I've photographed the Duke of Edinburgh, I've photographed Bob Menzies, and they'll all be in the show, yeah.
Unreal.
Yeah. And then a lot of other photographers. I've done a lot of work on Bill Henson, oddly enough. So I've been dragging out shots of Bill. It goes on and on.
And you will continue working on and on. We can certainly sense your energy through this conversation. And it's so inspiring. I want to ask, what's your advice for such a long and continued and energetic career?
I just love what I'm doing. And I'm technically quite advanced. I was the first photographer in Australia to go digital in 1992 when they just released the Macintosh Quadra. And I think of that 64 kilobits of memory. It used to take half an hour to reverse a photograph or to run a bit of sharpening. Anyway, I've just kept going. So I sort of had to pioneer the workflow for digital photography and getting digital work off to magazines. So I had my own CMYK proofer, and I mean, I really went into it. So I pioneered a digital workflow for every other photographer, but it's kept me ahead of the game. I've now got nearly 500 terabytes of data on a server.
How are you going now with AI?
Well, I'm loving it. Every single job is now AI'd, but only in the sense of using it to retouch, and the retouching it just speeds things up. I used to send work to India overnight, and because they would throw hundreds of little retouches at stuff, and then the latest Photoshop really gets away with those Indians, just this week, some new algorithms came out that they describe as conversational. So I just talk to the picture and say, do this and do that, and it just does it. And it's quite amazing.
And because you have that eye for art direction, really, and what you want to achieve from the image, you're able to give it very clear, very specific instructions.
And
right?
Sometimes it's just putting two different exposures together. I mean, yesterday I was doing a big house in Ballarat, and the sun kept coming in and out, but there were storm clouds in the sky. So you do one picture for the foreground and then another picture for a really dramatic storm, and then you put those together. And then the architect would say, but there's an air conditioning duct there, can you take it out? And so you just draw a circle around it and it goes, poof, gone. So it's a mixture of really intense AI. Exit signs all disappear. Sometimes people disappear. Sometimes people are put in.
I imagine for you really see it as a tool and an excellent opportunity.
Yes. Other people are using it to actually make photographs, and I'm not remotely interested. And they say make a picture in the manner of whatever. I'm just not interested. I mean, however, most of the commercials now on TV are AI generated.
Really?
And I think one of the things that you really do need to teach the next generation is how to recognise a fake or recognise something improbable.
It's becoming indiscernible now, especially with some of the latest models.
Yeah. I mean, just on the way here, before I left to come here, I saw this shot of a woman was feeding a giraffe, and she managed to put a hand in his mouth, and then the giraffe picked her up and threw her around the sky and walked. I mean, it's impossible.
Yeah.
But it looked incredibly realistic. So, yeah.
With the access now to drone photography, do you miss being up in the helicopter, or you still do that?
I miss it, but it was incredibly expensive and relatively dangerous. I had 2 fairly serious incidents in a helicopter.
Really?
Yeah. One in Hong Kong where we lost an engine and had to auto-rotate down to Kai Tak Airport. And another one was in Melbourne, photographing the stadium in Docklands. And at one stage, I saw the picture go out of focus, and the pilot, who was an old friend, been flying me for 20 years, said, we're being sucked in. And he said, I've got full stick back and nothing's happening. Anyway, it just pulled out the last minute before he crashed into the oval. It was just a downdraft. So,
wow.
Yeah, so I'm quite happy to not be in a helicopter. I flew every week for 20 years. In basically my own helicopter, my own company. So, But now I'm flying 3 different drones and having fun, because the drone can get up to that below helicopter height, but above a cherry picker. It's a really, it's good working around 500 feet or something. And I use a drone on every single job now.
Is there, so certainly from aerial photography, there's this moment where the subject abstracts and it becomes like a pattern.
Yep.
It becomes geometric, especially in some of the bushfire work, some of those images.
Yep. And that's my private documentation. And yes, you're exactly right. When I was doing the Venice Biennale, I was photographing all the mines out in the west, and I discovered that the overburden, the stuff that was dug up and dumped outside, when it got there, it oxidised into different colours and became Western Desert dot painting. And so there's a whole exhibition, which I just had in Sydney, of that imagery, aerial photography of the Australian landscape, basically untouched, but in compositions that no one had seen before. And that work thrills me, and I'm doing more and more of that. I've been photographing the pink lakes in Dimboola, and I'll get back to Uluru and stuff, shortly, as soon as I get a moment. I'm actually busier now than I've ever been in my life. There's not a day or a night free.
It's eternally fascinating looking at aerial imagery. I remember as a child being fascinated by those Earth from the Air books. It's like looking at pictures. And I wonder if it's the closest most of us mortals are able to get to the overview effect when the astronauts are up at the space station, they look back down on Earth and it humbles them in this interconnected appreciation.
I think so. And my understanding is looking at Indigenous art, which is, in fact, a map. And it's wayfinding. It's got the water holes. But that work has inspired me to actually take my own version of the Australian outback and the Australian country. And we live in a quite remarkable country, I must say.
And you're able to get out and see things that no one's ever seen before and share it with the rest of us.
Yeah. John Clements from Jackson Clements Burrows is a pilot, and he flies me around in his twin-engine Bonanza, and that's how we get to some of these very exotic places. So that's an architect with handy skills.
Even your pilot friends are architects.
Yeah.
What do you think the future is looking for, both our profession as someone who straddles the discipline, that you're part of architecture and architectural culture and architectural community, and you're also a photographer. Where do you see where we're going?
I think architecture's got a real problem.
Oh, yeah.
And I guess at the basis is creativity and design. I think AI is creeping in, and I notice now they're using AI to design buildings. And if you feed in the right data, you might get something. I'm not convinced that AI is particularly creative. I think it's good at absorbing what's gone before and regurgitating it. But I'm starting to see some excrescences that are coming out of AI design, where it's really someone just trying to be so different that it's trying too hard. And I miss the restraint of some of the good classic architects. The other problem I see is in urban design. I think there's just, the cities are becoming a mess now of competing egos lining the street. And yet people are still flocking to Europe and flocking to Paris because the Haussmann boulevards have got some stability to them. So I think there's problems all over the place, and I feel sorry for architects who are sensitive to it and trying to sort of not join the game.
Do you have a solution or a strategy?
Yes, it will come from education, and I think we've got to stop trying to teach people to be quite so different and radical. I almost don't know the words, but they've got to learn some restraint, I think.
You would advocate for a new movement, almost like a neo-modernism.
Yes. With some very skilled and educated teachers who can guide students. But I think at the moment they're being taught to be distinctly different to each other. And it's not necessarily the way to first analyse the problem and then work out the basic flow through a space and then build on the geometry and then respect your neighbour at the same time. I think that's the hard bit. And there's no respect now from building to building.
I say this with absolute affection. You don't think that they probably said the same about the football photograph and the kangaroo?
Yes, try too hard. Yes, all of that.
Back in the day?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't resile from it. It just happens to have ultimately caught a bit of imagination. But no, look, there's some fantastic bits of architecture. I just shot a house in Goa for James Gross. Climbed up over about 8 levels up a hillside. The client was a swimmer, so it has this 25-metre pool that she swims in all the time. Brilliant bit of off-form concrete. A really incredibly elegant, direct house of a series of interrelated forms. Just everything about it just said a genius bit of design. Ironically, the client was his fiancée who dumped him the day before their wedding and been sent off to India, where she then met, I think, the 4th richest man in India. And he was wonderful and married to him. And after trying all the local things, she said, "Oh, bugger it. You know, my ex is probably the best architect and he's done this brilliant job for them." So I got to stay there.
Bit of a happily ever after.
Yeah.
What's the most extreme length you've had to go to get the shot? What's the craziest thing you've had to do for the image?
Oh, look, I'm doing it right now for DCM. The ACMD building on the corner of Nicholson and Victoria has all these little angled windows, and some very lucky person in winter this year happened to be walking through the park and got the sun setting into the western face and went click with his bloody iPhone. And it's now become their hero shot, and they've asked me to redo it. And I've been back every night this week. The sun shows promise and then it doesn't, and then a cloud comes in. I think last night I went and did it again, and now I'm artificially putting in all the different colours. It's driving me mad.
Is that maybe something AI could help you with?
I suspect not. No, yeah, maybe, but I'm actually copying the original photograph.
I thought you might have a story for us about hanging off a cliff face or being in an extreme location, but sometimes it's those closer to home that really can push you.
Yes, I have, and it's probably been in China. It's been getting up onto some of those big construction sites to look out to do another one. And yeah, I've had a couple of close falls where you just nervously have to walk out 20 stories up on the external scaffolding.
No harnesses then?
No harnesses, no nothing, yeah. That's been pretty tricky. Another one was photographing the new Shanghai tennis stadium, and they'd got me an army helicopter, and it had this big opening petal roof, and they'd gone to a lot of trouble to get me there to photograph it, and it was late afternoon, except it was still a building site. And so I shot it. They opened the petals for me and I got the shot, but then I had to selectively blur all the other bits of it. You know, I got the great classic shot, but that was hard work. Just, you know, I didn't want to blow that helicopter trip either. So.
And you turn up to the sites and quite often it won't be as expected. It might not be squeaky clean and there could be crud in the way.
Yeah. And yes, you have various tricks. I don't like green grass and blue sky, so I try to get rid of them. One trick is I tend to shoot with backlight, which other photographers don't. And backlight is very efficient because it lets you have to open up the exposure, which then lets you look inside the building as well. So, I mean, my aim is to get one hero shot of a building. So the quickest way I can do it. The other quick way is to work at dusk. So you've got lights on inside the building and the setting sun, and that makes a very effective photograph. So that's another trick to speed up the process.
Do you have a dream building or a dream project to photograph?
I think it would be a difficult one. I love photographing whole cities because they're really hard to get a defining shot of a city. I've got one of Sydney at night from a helicopter looking across the Opera House and the bridge where it's all twinkling. Melbourne is a shot taken from the top of the Herald and Weekly Times building on a very difficult day where the government asked me to shoot a Christmas card for them. And I got permission to get on the roof of the building and I set the camera up and this rainstorm came in. I was about to give up. And I noticed a little bit of sun starting to peep through, so I kept the camera locked off. I got that shot. And then the sun opened up and then a black sky moved through and I got another shot. And then a rainbow came and pointed down at Fed Square and I got that. I put together about 6 shots to get the ultimate
4 seasons in one day.
4 seasons of Melbourne.
Wow.
And Melbourne's hard because it's always backlit. So, yeah, sometimes you just keep poking away. But so I suppose, my dream job would be a very difficult one that I can solve one way or another.
We look forward to the images. We look forward to many more exhibitions, many more publications. Thank you so much for joining me on the program, John. I will ask my last question because we are running out of time. And that is, what gives you hope?
I suppose the fact that the world lasted so long that I think it's going through a very difficult stage at the moment. Hope is that America gets rid of its current political system and resuscitates itself. But I also have hope for Australia. I think we're the great country. We want migrants. They've always done well for us. There's lots of room here. So, hope is for Australia and despair is for countries like America at the moment.
Thank you so much for joining me on the program, John. Thanks for joining me for another evening of Radio Architecture with Ilana Razbash. This live show was broadcast and recorded in the Radio Karim studio on Bunurong Country. You can replay the show wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for tuning in and supporting community radio. Take care.
Hello, I'm Mark Evans from Rose Tattoo and previously AC/DC, and you're listening to Radio Karim. Stay tuned.
Oi, 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 oi. IGA, it's shopping night. IGA, where the price is right. Seaford North IGA, for your groceries and liquor. IGA Express, there's nothing quicker.